Hello, UCAR. Peter Christensen here, coming to you from the CEO's desk with special guest star, the indubitable, indelible. I don't even know what that means. Indiscreet, interfering, indominus. I think that one Jurassic Park made up. Maybe it's a real word. I'll bet it's a real word. Craig Wagner. Thanks for joining us, Craig. So today's special, maybe special in my mind because it's the 5th anniversary of the first Legally Minded video I did. So 5 years ago, we did the first one, and we thought we were doing the 5th anniversary last year and brought Craig on, and then realized it was the 4th, and nobody cares about the 4th except July. They care a lot about the 4th. So we thought, hey, we got to do this with Craig and do it right. So welcome, Craig. Thanks for letting me steal some time out of your day and be a part of this 5th anniversary.
Thank you, Peter. I feel honored. I'm a little surprised UCAR is even open today, just because of how momentous this occasion is. But I'm glad to be part of it for sure.
For half a second, I thought you were going with the still open after more than 5 years of you being the CEO. That UCAR still made it. That's probably the bigger feat than 5 videos or 5 years of videos. Awesome. Well, yes, we're glad to have you. Nothing says 5 years like Craig Wagner. It's always the 5th anniversary. Well, Craig, we should probably give all 5 viewers of this video something legal to talk about. So, yeah, let's jump in. We were talking about offline the importance of the kind of, I mean, it's changed, but it hasn't changed. The approach has changed a little bit, right? But it's the whole idea of commissions in real estate, really how most agents get paid is through some sort of commission, and oftentimes a percentage of the sold price. Oftentimes there's some agreement to share some commission between brokerages. And this system's not new; it's been around for a long time. But in my time, which is 16, almost 16 years now, the although the system has not changed, the approach to it has a little bit, and we're seeing all kinds of outside influences now really challenging that system, even calling into question the validity of that system, and so really just kind of questioning whether it's the best way to do it. As I look at it, I still think it's a very, very good system when all things are considered with real estate and what goes into a real estate transaction. But what we're seeing now is the need, and I think indeed the prevalence of more openness about it, more communication about it. I don't know about openness. I mean, I don't know that in my time I've ever seen it be like, oh, we're trying to hide how commissions work. It just was sort of overlooked. It wasn't a focal point all the time. But I think more and more it's becoming a focal point in a transaction, and so that brings up all kinds of questions and maybe needs the need to augment practices a little bit, especially when approaching agency relationships and getting documents signed. And we've seen even changes in some of the documents addressing commission. So I don't know. What are your thoughts about this area?
Yeah, and I do agree. I think we're being more transparent. I think consumers are understanding how commissions are being paid more clearly, which is good. It's a really good thing. So For example, it is pretty clear under the buyer broker agreement, for example, we'll just start with the buyer broker agreement. It is pretty clear under that agreement who is responsible for the buyer brokerage's commission. Okay, it's the buyer, right? And having that dialogue with the buyer when you're signing the buyer broker agreement, that this is their responsibility to compensate you, but it may be offset by a third party, i.e., the buyer broker commission that's being offered on the MLS, or even the seller within the terms of the REPC. That makes it much more clear to the buyer how those responsibilities can be met. Because many buyers don't have the funds because they're going to be applying much of that to the down payment of the purchase, right? And so the MLS and the interworkings of the negotiations in the contract do help facilitate that paying of commissions, that obligation under the buyer broker agreement. But I do think first and foremost, we're making it much more clear as an industry as a whole that it is, for example, the buyer's responsibility. And ultimately, I don't care what a brokerage charges for their commission. I really don't. But we should be able to clearly define what it is we do to earn that commission, right? And from my perspective, and I understand that it's biased, the value proposition is going to be in the writing of the contract and helping the buyer in this case navigate the ins and outs of the contract. But ultimately, what you charge, it's going to be up to you to make that as clear as possible. So that's just taking the buyer side. Now, if you take the flip side with the listing, it is a listing broker's obligation to have that same discussion with the seller, not only about the overall compensation, but what is going to be shared and marketed across the MLS. And you'll notice in at least the UAR exclusive right to sell listing agreement, it makes it very clear what's going to be offered on the MLS. And it makes it very clear that the seller has consented or acknowledged that amount that's going to be advertised across the MLS. So there is no set commission when it comes to the seller and the listing brokerage or buyer and the buyer's brokerage. It's completely negotiable, but there needs to be transparency and explanation to help set those expectations and to make clear as to how this can play within the contract. I'll end with one point, and then I can turn back over to you. The advertising of commissions on the MLS, it's public facing, right? I mean, members of the public, they don't need a real estate agent per se to find what's being offered as far as compensation. That's public. And so the idea of, again, having the agency agreements signed so that you can make clear, what is it I'm doing for you, right? What am I doing to earn my commission? To justify hiring me. Now, you and I, Peter, we know pretty clearly as to what the value is for a realtor member and how a buyer and a seller can benefit from using a realtor. But we need to do a good job in explaining that, because there is kind of a mentality of, I don't, do it yourself, right? And so we need to be very clear as to what we're going to provide, what we're going to charge, and hopefully the client receives that expectation, receives what they've bargained for, so to speak.
Yeah, their expectations are met.
Yeah.
I think that's the key, because there is a lot of latitude in how much you charge and what services you provide. And the Division of Real Estate in Utah has made it pretty clear that we're going to give some latitude to brokerages and clients to negotiate the services. It's not going to be a preset package. You have to do this much. But you and I, we get the phone calls. Lance gets the complaints when expectations are not met, right? And that's, I think, your part. And compensations is a part of that discussion, I think. And so you hit on something really, really important that I like. And if I recall, it's been an evolution over the past, 5-7 years of how the the compensation that's being shared by a listing brokerage potentially to a buyer's brokerage is delineated in the listing agreement, right? It's more pronounced that there's more of an emphasis on that now because, and I would argue it should always have been disclosed to a seller. This is what, out of the total commission, this is what we are sharing, offering to a buyer's brokerage. And it does have an effect, right? Because like you said, the day has come. I used to teach this, 12, 13 years ago. I would love it if a buyer was looking at listings and said, boy, that one is in the right neighborhood, the right square footage, and yet it's a little cheaper than everything else. Oh, that's because the commission being offered, there isn't any, or it's lower than the others, and it doesn't match my buyer broker agreement, so I'm going to have to come up with the difference potentially. And that buyers were that aware. Well, I think they're becoming more aware of that, and that discussion is being had more often because agents can't so easily rely on a set compensation that they're likely to get. And again, the system's always been set up that way. I think it just worked more with less changes, with less surprises in the past, but now we're seeing more and more listings with a variety of different commission offerings, and it's being more of a discussion with a buyer's agent and their buyers. And so, long roundabout way to get there, but sellers now, it can affect what buyers might be attracted to their property by what compensation is offered, because if a buyer's having to come up with money out of their pocket and they don't have it, they may overlook that property for something similar where the listing brokerage is compensating their agent instead of the buyer compensating their agent. So, but yeah, again, the discussion needs to happen with both the buyer and seller for them to be a participant in that discussion. So let's talk about the evolution too of this idea, and now there's a forum for it, probably in the last 5 years, this idea of a client, so a principal, buyer or seller, asking the other side, usually it's probably going to be a buyer, asking a seller to pay some of the commission to their agent. First of all, is that illegal to ask? And I've already kind of given that answer away because I said there's a forum for it, but not illegal. Let's walk through that and maybe your thoughts on how that came about and how it's changed anything.
Yeah, so the specific form you're mentioning is the real estate brokerage payment addendum. Now, to be clear, and the form makes it clear, this does not modify what the listing broker is offering as compensation to a buyer's brokerage. It's in addition to. So for example, let's say I have a buyer broker agreement signed with my buyer, and let's just say it says that my buyer will pay me 2.5%. Let's just say that. So it says 2.5%, but we find a property where the offer of compensation by the listing brokers, let's just say it's 1%. So we've already kind of gone through that the differential there will be the responsibility of the buyer. In this case, it's 1.5%.
Per the buyer broker agreement.
Exactly. So one, that's assuming that you have a buyer broker agreement signed, which, I know it's easy for me to say, but I would say get that signed as soon as possible so that you have clear expectations as you're looking at properties and, beginning to make offers. And then two, you've explained that. So what are some ways to deal with that differential, that deficit, so to speak? Well, one, the buyer could pay it out of pocket. Well, 1.5% of the purchase price, that may be a significant amount. So they may not have those funds to pay you. Okay, so the other option would be they don't make an offer on the property. Okay, that may not be satisfactory because they really want the property. A third option, and that would be using this addendum, would be to have as part of your offer the buyer asking the seller Notice I said buyer asking the seller, not buyer's brokerage asking the listing brokerage. Buyer asking the seller to pay, in this case, 1.5%. And again, that would be in addition to what's being offered by the listing brokerage. So a total, in this case, of 2.5%, which would satisfy the buyer's obligation under the buyer broker agreement in this hypothetical, right? And so if the seller agrees, just like the seller oftentimes will agree to pay a third party on behalf of the buyer, like closing costs, interest rate buy downs are a common marketing tool. This is something that's negotiable between the buyer and the seller. And so even though commissions are being put into the REPC, it does not change the offer of compensation from the listing brokerage. I know I sound like a broken record there, but that's
It tells me you've had to explain this a few times.
That's intentional, because I know that there was maybe some misunderstanding under the Code of Ethics, specifically Standard of Practice 16-16, where it talks about not using the terms of the offer to modify the offer of compensation, which that is different than saying, hey, commissions can't be in the REPC, which they can be, but it's the REPC is a contract between the buyer and the seller. The offer of compensation on the MLS is between two different contracting parties, listing broker and buyer's brokerage. So that would be a simple way. And I have heard positive feedback where it's worked. It's a way for the buyer to, it's kind of the proverbial win-win. If the seller is willing to pay for that, where the buyer's still able to make an offer, seller's, willing to sell the property at that price. And typically it works out fine. Certainly a buyer is going to want to talk to their lender about that to see if there's any questions there, but we've had positive feedback, which has been great. It's been in existence, I think, since 2019. So it has a period, and certainly in a seller's market, sellers may be less inclined to agree to something like that. In a more buyer-friendly market, sellers may be willing to accept that. So it's just a point of negotiation that could help a buyer make an offer on a property that maybe otherwise they wouldn't, because it's been clearly explained to them their obligations under the buyer broker agreement.
Yeah. It's what it is another tool. It's another opportunity for, it's another avenue to get a deal done. It's another, it's empowering to the buyer and seller, because now they have something that can help them, again, give them another option for how to get this deal done. And I think it's really, but again, it involves that conversation. I'm going to sound like a broken record. It involves you having that conversation with the buyer and seller as to how commissions work. And I have not seen the downside to having that conversation, because you're just involving them. So when things go sideways, when things aren't working as smoothly as they could, you don't have to now fight a misconception by a buyer and seller about how things work and have them not understand why something's getting complicated. Instead, you have their full participation. They understand it. It's empowering to them to get the deal done.
And I will say this, when there were multiple offers on properties, right, where it was super competitive, where buyers were trying to make their offers stand out, I did see or hear about buyers writing in their offer their willingness to pay the seller's obligation under the listing agreement. Okay, now we don't have a specific form for that, but that just goes to show it can go both ways as far as the negotiations, where again, you're looking for ways to incentivize the other party to accept your offer. And so I did hear on the flip side. So I don't want to make it seem like it's only one way, but it is typical, and our form is really meant to kind of satisfy that buyer obligation under the buyer broker.
Yeah, but there's same opportunity for a buyer to ask a seller. That's interesting. I had not heard during all that craziness of a buyer offering to pay a seller's commissions. Why not?
And there could be some reasons for that. Now the purchase price is maybe a little bit lower, but it still nets the seller a little bit more because now they don't have this other obligation. So yeah, there could be some reasons why it could be mutually beneficial if they're already
Interesting.
willing to pay, a high
Right.
amount for a property.
Right. Awesome. Good stuff. Okay, let's wrap it up. Any other thoughts? I know we had a great discussion earlier about this, but I feel like we've covered a lot of it. I think the whole point is that the conversation nationally, really, around commissions is being had. And the point is, I think clients are getting more and more involved in the conversation. And as you pointed out, we've always, as an agent, you got to be able to prove your worth. And I think you do. I think from what I've seen, different models come and go, different markets come and go. It's really tested lately, the system, and it's holding up in my mind. And I think that this discussion of commissions doesn't need to be a scary one. I've seen many approaches of, I am worth it. I'm not afraid to say I'm worth it, and others who aren't quite as sure. And so anyway, any last thoughts on commissions and the discussions and forums? Anything you wanted to point out?
Sure. The last thing that I'll say is that there, while the form that we just talked about is between the buyer and the seller, we do have an additional form that allows the listing broker and the buyer's brokerage to modify the offer of compensation, because there could be instances, for example, where a buyer's brokerage and a listing brokerage agree to take less, to make the deal work, which, I've heard of agents, willing to do that to help the deal, where the seller still nets the same, the buyer maybe gets some concessions, and the agent says, yeah, I'm willing to reduce my overall commission. Great. That would just be mutually done between the buyer's brokerage and the listing brokerage, and then the listing brokerage with their seller, and then the buyer with their buyer's brokerage, just kind of modifying those respective contracts. But yeah, that would be my last point, is that there is that additional mechanism when it comes to commissions and making modifications to them.
Awesome. Good stuff. Well, as always, remember, this is not specific legal advice. This is legal information only. If you need specific legal advice, please contact your attorney. Thanks for tuning in, and big thank you to Craig for joining us on this momentous, magnificent. I don't know what I'm doing today. Why am I doing this, Craig?
I don't know.
Occasion. This special occasion of 5 years. It's been fun. And thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone.